Excellencies, Chairman Shen, dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In September of 2003, Kofi Annan famously gave a speech titled "A Fork in the Road." He was deeply worried at the time about recent events that, in his view, had indeed put the world at a point where tough choices had to be made. The UN Secretary General's serious concern essentially stemmed from a reemergence of unilateralism and disregard of international law, whose chief expression had been the invasion of Iraq earlier that year. Annan thought that the unilateral use of force that is not properly sanctioned by the Security Council in reaction to real or even just perceived threats such as terrorism or weapons of mass destruction pose a fundamental challenge to the principles on which, however imperfectly, world peace and stability had rested during almost 6 decades. He was raising the alert about a precedent that could result in the unilateral and lawless use of force with or without justification. That precedent, he warned, would run against the belief in collective answers to our common problems and challenges, and neglected the shared vision of global solidarity and collective security that had been pledged in the Millennium Declaration 3 years earlier in September of 2000. The international rules-based system and certainly its key multilateral institutions have been under an incredibly brutal and unprecedented assault during almost 4 years. Although there is much blame to go around for the damage inflicted recently to the multilateral system, the United States' share as an aggressor stands out by far. The Trump administration has literally vandalized many of the system's institutions and agreements, which ironically were spearheaded and used to the United States' own national advantage since their founding by that very country. Instances of such assault abound. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the UN Human Rights Council, and the UNESCO, the termination of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the refusal to negotiate and join the Global Compact for Migration, the repudiation of the Iran nuclear deal, and the paralysis of the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism. Although practically all of the Trump government's attacks on the international system can be shown to be against the national interests of the US itself, this result is strikingly evident in the case of Trump's trade policy. Consider for a moment the main components of such a policy. 1. The Trump administration aimed to correct the trade and current account deficit that for many years has been a feature of the American economy. The wrong-headed approach to pursue this equally wrong-headed goal was to engage aggressively, one by one, the country's main trade partners and force deals supposedly to fix the respective imbalances. This approach, which not only ignored the basic insights stemming from the essential notion of comparative advantage in its modern version and the basic national income identity, but also conceives of international trade as a bellicose zero-sum game, led the US government to use self-defeating protectionism to try to fix the external imbalance. The result? The US trade deficit in August reached its highest level in 14 years, thus recording for the period of January to August a trade gap of $422 billion, up despite the dramatic global economic slowdown, almost 6% from equivalent period of last year. 2, on day 3 of his administration, Trump withdrew the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, without providing any economic or geopolitical justification for the move. That this action went against the interests of the US is clear from the fact that the TPP was agreed and constructed really to satisfy the interests and demands as well as the standards and practices of the US to a much greater extent than any previous trade agreement ever subscribed by that country. The result? Trump's decision caused the US to incur not only a meaningful economic cost, but also a substantial loss in geopolitical influence in a critical part of the world. Furthermore, the 11 remaining partners slightly modified the TPP agreement and signed it in March of 2018. Interestingly, too, a few days ago, on November 15, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was formally signed. It is an agreement among China and 14 other nations from Japan to New Zealand to Myanmar. This pact was spearheaded by China, purportedly, in the view of some observers, as a counterweight to American influence in the region. The successful negotiation of this pact, which is now the largest free trade agreement in the world, truly highlights Trump's inanity of dropping, for no good reason for the US interests, the TPP. 3, based on fallacious arguments, Trump forced Mexico and Canada to renegotiate NAFTA. Although his negotiators did not get all the rather awkward demands they maintained throughout most of the talks, they did get an agreement now called USMCA. This, for the most part, by diminishing the region's competitiveness in global markets, is clearly inferior to the old NAFTA. The result with the USMCA, both Mexico and Canada lose, but so does the US as well. 4, the Trump administration, by blocking the appointment of new members of the appellate body of the dispute settlement mechanism, has crippled the WTO. To justify his animosity towards the WTO, Trump has argued that his country loses almost all lawsuits and that the system has been terrible for the US. The facts: the US is the most frequent user of the dispute settlement system, having brought to it more cases than China and the European Union combined. And the US has a higher proportion of cases won, 91%, than the rest of the complainants. No serious analysis has ever produced evidence of bias against the United States. Almost always, one of the judges of the appellate body has been an American, a circumstance not enjoyed by any other country. What traditionally has upset American officials is to lose cases brought against US trade remedy actions, anti-dumping and countervailing duties. It is clear, however, that those complaints are caused first and foremost by the US's own aggressive use of such remedy actions that plainly violate the rules agreed at the WTO, rules certainly accepted by the US itself. The result: one of the best and most useful multilateral institutions, the WTO, has been left in a state of hibernation by the courtesy of the Trump government. 5, initiating unjustified trade wars has been the most egregious trade policy by the Trump administration. It did so against its friendly trade partners like Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and the European countries by imposing tariffs arbitrarily on imports of products such as steel and aluminum, on the grounds that they constitute a threat to the country's national security. The illegality of this action was flagrant and was opined immediately by many experts. Still, the unwarranted and abusive treatment of its friendly trade partners pales in comparison to the trade aggressiveness displayed by the US government against China. Step by step, although rather quickly, the Trump administration set off an authentic trade war practically without precedent since the 1930s. Regretfully, but not surprisingly, China responded in kind. The clock of these two countries' trade cooperation and interdependence has been set back many years. Every serious legal and economic analysis of the arguments provided by the US government to justify its massive trade attacks on China have been found the alleged American justification questionable in the best of cases, if not patently illegal. The result, the US has not won the trade war initiated by Trump. Actually, there are never winners in these kinds of episodes, and it has been left to the American consumers, farmers, and taxpayers to suffer the folly of Trump's acute trade bellicosity against China. The ill-fated events of recent years have led to a boom in the dubious occupation of predicting unavoidable fatalities. Concepts such as Thucydides' trap or the Cold War have been given a renaissance by pundits of geopolitics. Much ink has been spent in describing the inevitable confrontations to come, including the military ones, rather than denouncing the folly of the tit-for-tat game being irresponsibly played by global powers. That is how the world has arrived at a 2021 vintage fork-in-the-road situation, a much more challenging circumstance than the one described by Kofi Annan in 2003. The global powers can choose to move forward along the path that in all likelihood would lead to disaster. This path is about dismissing the rules-based international system, neglecting the value of international cooperation, reaffirming unilateral or at best bilateral approaches to address issues of truly collective interest, expanding on military capabilities instead of on diplomacy and human well-being, continuing to blame the others and interdependence for the social consequences of essentially homegrown policy failures, continuing to look at international trade, investment, and migration as zero-sum games. In short, proceeding to undo the positive aspects of the world order painstakingly constructed only after the shameful experiences, 2 world wars, and a Great Depression suffered in the first half of the 20th century. Staying on this path could lead to a repetition, or even much worse, of past episodes of immense, unnecessary, and unjust human sufferings. Or the global powers, joined decisively by enlightened emerging countries, can decide to work together on the other path where international peace and prosperity, which are good for every country, if not guaranteed, indeed constitute the most probable outcome. Needless to say, moving on that path, despite its promise, will not be easy. For one thing, inertia towards the other direction has gained significant momentum in recent years. The adversarial view of the world has become influential even among otherwise cosmopolitan citizens, of open societies. Repairing the damage suffered by international relations and cooperation will be a work of patience, diplomatic craftsmanship, and a slow recovery of mutual trust. But let me emphasize that although the United States has been the worst offender during the Trump administration, the reconstruction and improvement of the system requires the goodwill and effort of all the other stakeholders. Of course, the Biden government must proceed decisively to repair the most egregious misdeeds of the ongoing U.S. government, as already committed by the president-elect himself. Observing the U.S. return to the international agreements and institutions repudiated by Mr. Trump will be not only a source of relief to the rest of the world, but also a firm step towards the restoration of the country's leadership and respectability. However, great responsibility rests with the others. This is certainly the case for China. Under the enlightened leadership of Chairman Shen Biyan, the Institute has been an impressive generator of good ideas and an effective convener of individuals and institutions committed to the high causes of peace, prosperity, and harmonious interdependence. From my experience as chairman of the 21st Century Council of the Berggruen Institute, thanks to our joint endeavors, notably the periodic organization of the Understanding China Conference, I can provide testimony to how valuable the CIIDS has proven to be. I am very confident that this remarkable institution will continue to thrive in the years to come. Thank you very much.